These reflections on violence have made us realize the frequent discrepancy between the cadres of the Nationalist Party and the masses, and the way they are out of step with each other. In any union or political organization, there is a traditional gap between the masses, who demand an immediate, unconditional improvement of their situation, and the cadres who, gauging the difficulties likely to be created by employers, put a restraint on their demands. Hence, the oft-remarked tenacious discontent of the masses with regard to the cadres. After a day of demonstration, while the cadres are celebrating victory, the masses well and truly get the feeling they have been betrayed. It is the repeated demonstrations for their rights and the repeated labor disputes that politicize the masses. A politically informed union official is someone who knows that a local dispute is not a crucial confrontation between him and management. The colonized intellectuals who, in their respective metropolises, have studied the mechanism of political parties, establish similar organizations so as to mobilize the masses and put pressure on the colonial administration. The formation of nationalist parties in the colonized countries is contemporary with the birth of an intellectual and business elite. These elite attach primordial importance to the organizations as such, and blind devotion to the organization often takes priority over a tradition or over a rational study of colonial society. The notion of party is a notion imported from the metropolis. This instrument of modern resistance is grafted onto a protean, unbalanced reality where slavery, bondage, barter, cottage industries, and stock transactions exist side by side. So, already here we see that business and intellectual elites see the nationalist parties as the most important thing to guiding the nation forward, despite the fact that these nationalist parties, as we see in the previous chapter, they're being born of the metropolis and not necessarily representing the whole of colonized society, i.e. the peasantry, farming, or pre-proletarian classes. And he's about to get into it in the next paragraph. The weakness of political parties lies not only in their mechanical imitation of an organization which is used to handling the struggle of the proletariat within a highly industrialized capitalist society. Innovations and adaptations should have been made as to the type of organization at a local level. The great mistake, the inherent flaw of most of the political parties in the underdeveloped regions has been traditionally to address first and foremost the most politically conscious elements, the urban proletariat, the small tradesmen, and the civil servants, i.e., a tiny section of the population which represents barely more than 1%. However, although this proletariat understood the party propaganda and read its publications, it was much less prepared to respond to any slogans taking up the unrelenting struggle for national liberation. It has been said many times that in colonial territories, the proletariat is the kernel of the colonized people most pampered by the colonial regime. The embryonic urban proletariat is relatively privileged. In the capitalist countries, the proletariat has nothing to lose and possibly everything to gain. In the colonized countries, the proletariat has everything to lose privileged position they occupy in the colonial system represent the bourgeois fraction of the colonized population. So the urban proletariat comprises the bulk of the nationalist parties, yet represents the smallest fraction of the population. Only, bigger than the urban bourgeoisie. So it is understandable that the clientele of the nationalist parties is above all urban technicians, manual workers, intellectuals, and tradespeople living mainly in the towns. Their way of thinking in many ways already bears the mark of the technically advanced and relatively comfortable environment in which they live. Here, modernism, quote unquote, is king. These are the very same circles which will oppose obscurantist traditions and propose innovations, thereby entering into open conflict with the old granite foundation that is the national heritage. The majority of the nationalist parties regard the rural masses with great mistrust. These masses give them the impression of being mired in inertia and sterility. Fairly quickly, the Nationalist Party members, the urban workers and intellectuals, end up passing the same pejorative judgment on the peasantry as the colonists. In our endeavor to understand the reasons for this distrust of the rural masses by the political parties, we should not forget that colonialism has often strengthened or established its domain by an organized petrification of the peasantry, regimented by marabouts, witch doctors, and traditional chiefs. The rural masses still live in a feudal state whose overbearingly medieval structure is nurtured by the colonial administrators and army. So he's mentioned marabouts a couple times, and I had no idea what the term was, but I guess they're a kind of Muslim religious leader or teacher, not quite the same as an imam or something of that nature. The young national bourgeoisie, especially the business sector, now competes with these feudal rulers in a number of areas. Marabouts and witch doctors prevent the sick from consulting a physician. The rulings of the Jemas make lawyers redundant. The Cades use their political and administrative powers to launch a trucking business or establish a commerce. The local chiefs oppose the introduction of trade and new products in the name of religion and tradition. The young class of colonized businessmen and traders needs to eliminate these prohibitions and barriers in order to grow. The indigenous clientele, which represents the exclusive preserve of the feudal overlords and sees itself more or less banned from purchasing new products, constitutes therefore a market which both parties are fighting over. The feudal agents form a barrier between the young westernized nationalists and the masses. Every time the elite makes a gesture towards the rural masses, the tribal chiefs, the religious rulers, and the traditional authorities issue repeated warnings, threats, and communications. These traditional authorities, sanctioned by the occupying power, feel threatened by the growing endeavors of the elites to infiltrate the rural masses. They know too well that the ideas imported by these urban elements are likely to threaten the very existence of their feudal authority. As a result, their enemy is not the occupying power with whom, in fact, they get along very well, but these modernists who are bent on dislocating the indigenous society and in doing so take the bread out of their mouths. So he's gonna hit back on this dynamic a bunch in this chapter or section. He talks a lot about how the tribal leaders actually get along a lot better with the colonial authorities, because they're the people who kind of allow them to retain power, even as colonialism kind of takes away everyone else's autonomy. Meanwhile, the proletariat, the urban proletariat, and other classes that are starting to form, and the bourgeois of the colonized are basically vying for the same position almost. The westernized elements, feelings toward the peasant masses recall those found among the proletariat in industrialized nations. The history of bourgeois revolutions and the history of proletarian revolutions have demonstrated that the peasant masses often represent a curb on revolution. In the industrialized countries, the peasant masses are generally the least politically conscious, the least organized, as well as the most anarchistic elements. They are characterized by a series of features: individualism, lack of discipline, the love of money, fits of rage, and deep depression, defining an objectively reactionary behavior. When we see the nationalist parties base their methods and doctrines on the Western parties, and therefore, in the majority of cases, do not direct their propaganda at the rural masses. In fact, a rational analysis of colonial society would have shown them that the colonized peasants live in a traditional environment whose structures have remained intact, whereas in the industrialized countries, it is these traditional circles which have been splintered by the progress of industrialization. It is within the burgeoning proletariat that we find individualistic behavior in the colonies. Abandoning the countryside and its insoluble problems of demography, the landless peasants, now a lumpen proletariat, are driven into the towns, crammed into shanty towns, and endeavor to infiltrate the ports and cities, the creations of colonial domination. As for the mass of the peasantry, they continue to live in a petrified context, and those who cannot scrape a living in the countryside have no other choice but to emigrate to the cities. The peasant who stays put is a staunch defender of tradition, and in a colonial society represents the element of discipline whose social structure remains community-minded. Such a static society, clinging to a rigid context, can, of course, sporadically generate episodes of religious fanaticism and tribal warfare, but in their spontaneity, the rural masses remain disciplined and altruistic. The individual steps aside in favor of the community. So I know he talked about how the tribal leaders are kind of in league with the colonizers, but here he talks about he's saying that while the peasant masses of industrialized countries are often less organized and highly individualized, it's much less true of the colonized indigenous peasantry. As a colonial society encroaches on their traditional communities, the indigenous peasantry ends up holding steadfast onto their communities and traditions, making them far more cohesive and community-minded, community-oriented, and receptive to dressed like a European, speaking his language, working alongside him, sometimes living in his neighborhoods. He is considered by the peasant to be a renegade who has given up everything which constitutes the national heritage. The town dweller is a traitor, a mercenary, who apparently gets along very well with the occupier and strives to succeed in the context of the colonial system. Hence the reason why we often hear the peasants say that the town dwellers have no moral standards. This is not the traditional opposition between town and country. It is the opposition between the colonized, excluded from the benefits of colonialism, and their counterparts, who manage to turn the colonial system to their advantage. The colonists, moreover, use this antagonism in their opposition to the nationalist parties. They mobilize the population in the mountains and the interior against the urban population. They set the back country against the coast. They revive tribal identities, and it should come as no surprise to see Kalanji crowned king of Kasai, or some years back the Assembly of Chiefs in Ghana hold its ground against Nkrumah. So Kalanji split from Patrice Lumumba's MNC party in the Congo to form a separatist party under which his father was crowned king. Then his father abdicated to Kalanji himself, crowning him king. In his goal to unify, liberate, and pull Ghana from poverty, Kwame Nkrumah ended up suppressing tribalism in Ghana, implementing a policy to, quote, prohibit organizations using or engaging in racial or religious propaganda to the detriment of any other racial or religious community, or securing the elections of persons on account of their racial or religious affiliations, or for other purposes in connection therewith. During the British colonial period, Ghanaian tribal leaders kept their authority and often collaborated with their colonizers. Fanon's using these two examples to illustrate the ways in which the colonial powers use existing differences, be they racial, ethnic, tribal affiliations, to divide the colonized people against each other. As such, tribal identity must be subsumed by a national identity, lest the colonial powers use those divisions against the colonized people. In Nkrumah's attempt to unify the country, he saw the necessity for suppressing tribal elements in as much as they discriminated against one another, because at the time he's trying to decolonize the country, not just in like the physical sense of like kicking all the colonizers out, but also to decolonize them mentally and psychologically and politically. The political parties are unable to establish roots in the countryside. Instead of adapting the existing structures in order to invest them with nationalist or progressive elements, they are intent on disrupting traditional existence within the context of the colonial system. They imagine they can jumpstart the nation, whereas the mesh of the colonial system is still tightly interlocked. They make no effort to reach out to the masses. They do not place their theoretical knowledge at the service of the people, but instead try to regiment the masses according to a predetermined schema. Consequently, they parachute into the villages inexperienced or unknown leaders from the capital who, empowered by the central authorities, endeavor to manage the douar or the village like a company committee. The traditional chiefs are ignored, sometimes taken down a peg, instead of integrating the history of the village and conflicts between tribes and clans Occupier services have no scruples making use of the ensuing resentment and are kept informed of the slightest decision adopted by this caricature of authority. A well-informed police repression based on factual intelligence gathering is quick to follow. The leaders parachuted in from the outside, and the main members of the new assembly are arrested. These setbacks confirm the theoretical analysis of the nationalist parties. The disastrous attempts at regimenting the rural population reinforces the party's distrust and crystallize their aggressiveness towards this section of the population. After the victorious struggle for national liberation, the same mistakes are repeated, fostering the trend to decentralize and self-govern. The tribalism of the colonial phase is replaced by regionalism, and the national phase expressed institutionally as federalism. But it so happens that the rural masses, in spite of the little control the parties have over them, play a crucial role, either in gestation of national consciousness or in relaying the initiatives of the nationalist parties, and in some cases taking over purely and simply from the party's sterility. The nationalist parties help to solidify and reinforce the divisions when they send inexperienced or unknown leaders to organize the villages. Those leaders, quote unquote, that they send in disrespect and disenfranchise tribal leaders and elders when what Fanon is trying to say, they should be integrating them into their organization. This makes elders hate the nationalist party leaders, and the colonial powers are quick to take advantage of those animosities. The nationalist party leaders try to plow ahead in organizing the communities without taking the time to understand their histories. Because of this, those who could have been potent allies in the national struggle become dire enemies, and these animosities remain even after the colonizing force is rooted out. Thank you for watching this reading of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. If you like what I do, please consider giving a like to the video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. If you want to see more of what I do or want to support me, check out all my links in the description. Those include my music, ways to follow me on Twitch and Twitter, and also ways you can maybe throw me a couple bucks. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you soon.